So now let's talk about tech stacks. So as I was talking about before in one of the previous classes, whenever you're going to be building a solution using a programming language, you're not going to generally be able to create the overall solution with just that single language. One of the big problems I see with new people that try to come into the technology industry is they ask, Eli, what is the one language that I need to be successful, or the one product that I need to be successful in order to get me those wonderful six-figure jobs? And the thing that I have to explain to folks is that it's not going to be one language, right? As I've talked about in the previous class, even if you're creating a relatively basic web application, you're going to use HTML, you're going to use CSS, there's a good chance you're going to use JavaScript, you're going to use a back-end language such as Python or PHP. In a lot of our classes, we use a framework on top of that, something called the Bottle Web App Framework. And then you're going to be connecting to a database that's going to use a SQL structured query language, and then all of that is probably going to reside within the Linux operating system, so that you also have to understand Linux too. And basically, when I talk about all those different components, that is the stack. Right? So you might do some coding in Python, you might do some coding in JavaScript. That will be one component of the overall product, but your overall product is going to be built from all of these different technologies that come together to be able to solve the problem that you're trying to solve for. Now, when you hear about tech stacks, people will most likely throw some acronyms at you. LAMP stacks, WAMP stacks, MERN stacks, MEAN stacks, and they might even say the Microsoft stack, that type of thing. The important thing to understand with those acronyms is basically where those names come from is simply the first letter of every product that you're using for the stack. So if you're talking about the LAMP stack, that's Linux, Apache, MySQL, and PHP. We'll talk about that in a second. If we're talking about the WAMP stack, would be Windows, Apache, MySQL, and PHP. But basically, that's what people are talking about when they toss out the names for these stacks. So a lot of the stacks that you're going to hear about are going to be kind of the standardized, what all the cool kids are using. But it's important to understand that's just an acronym for all the products that they're using in their stack. For you, you might decide to create a stack using different products, and so that'll create its own name that you get to figure out. Again, you might be going into an environment where they decided to build a stack on their own particular products, and so there will be a different acronym for that, or they might just say our stack and be done with it. So again, when you hear about LAMP and WAMP and MERN and MEAN and some of these other things, don't get too fixated on that. Don't feel like this is the stack that you have to learn, something like that. That's just basically a shorthand for trying to tell people what stack that you're using so that they understand what environment they're going into. So with that, let's go over to my little whiteboard so I can sketch this out for a second, just so you get an idea visually of what a stack looks like. So now let's take a look at something called the LAMP stack. So when we talk about the LAMP stack, it is Linux, Apache, MySQL, and PHP. So if we're looking at this stack, basically at the bottom, this is going to be the operating system, and we are going to be using Linux here. Now we just say Linux. We don't say Ubuntu or Red Hat or CentOS or Arch or anything else. We just say Linux. On top of that, we are then going to have Apache. So what is Apache? Apache is a web server. So when you create a web application, the server itself is going to need an application to present that website, that web application, to visitors that are coming to your site. And so that's where we use Apache. Again, when we talk about the different stacks that you could have Nginx, which is something that we use every once in a while, which would then turn this into an, I don't know what would that be? LNMP stack, which again is where these acronyms break down sometimes. But then on top of that, on the stack would be MySQL. So MySQL is a relational database, and so that's one that's used, especially for a lot of students and for a lot of small projects out there. There's MySQL, there's also MariaDB is one of the relational databases out there. There is SQLite. And again, this is where things can get confusing. So there are other options out there other than MySQL, but that's generally the database that would be used in a LAMP stack. And then on top would be PHP. So that is the back-end programming language, pre-hypertext processor, as the cool kids call it. Which isn't true. None of the cool kids care about PHP anymore, but PHP exists, and basically this is what PHP is what is going to go, and it's going to communicate with a MySQL database, it's going to communicate with a Linux operating system, it's going to communicate with the visitors, and basically what it's going to do is it's going to dynamically create the web page when your users are going to it. So this is what a LAMP stack looks like. There is something called a WAMP stack. Again, for the old timers, I don't know, again, does the WAMP stack still exist? But basically, it's the same kind of stack, right? We basically essentially got 4 levels here. The difference is it's Windows on the bottom. You then have Apache on top of that. You then have MySQL on top of that. And then you have PHP on top of that. And so it's a WAMP stack. So this was a big thing for me, again, to be honest with you, about 20 years ago, right? If you're going to be deploying your web application, you needed to know, are you going to be deploying it to LAMP, where you're going to be deploying it to a Linux operating system, or are you going to be deploying it to WAMP, which would be a Windows operating system? There's some licensing and all kinds of stuff that goes along with that. But basically, this is the idea of what a stack looks like. Now, you will notice we don't talk about HTML here because, yeah, of course you're going to use HTML. We don't talk about CSS here because, yeah, of course we don't. Yeah, we're going to be using CSS. And then JavaScript. Most of the time, like JavaScript isn't talked about in the stack, though if you're using a JavaScript framework, it is. So if you were using, let's say, React on top of this, then you'd have a RWAP. I don't know. So the JavaScript frameworks are usually talked about within the acronym. JavaScript itself is not. And again, that basically gives you that framework there again, or if it gives you the tech stack there. If you're looking at how we build things here at Silicon Dojo for a lot of projects, again, if we take a look at this, we're going to be using Linux, or basically an X, a star X operating system. Again, a lot of projects I show you, we actually use Mac OS. Mac OS is built on top of Unix, so it would be an X OS. Then on top of that, we use something called Python as the back-end programming language. On top of that, we use something called the Bottle web app framework that allows us to turn Python code into an actual web application. And then on top of that, we use a database called SQLite. So we use a tech stack there. Again, the acronyms kind of fall apart after a little bit, but this is what we're talking about when we're talking about tech stacks. Now, if we go over to Google and we ask for some of the popular tech stacks out there, again, we can see some of these other stacks. So mean stack. So this is MongoDB. So this is a database a lot of the new people like to use. Express.js, which is a back-end JavaScript framework. Angular allows you to create front ends. Node.js is a runtime environment. And so that's what the mean stack looks like. You have the MERN stack, also MongoDB, Express.js. You're then using React as a front-end framework and Node.js. So you got the MERN stack there. We have the LAMP stack, we have the Ruby on Rails stack, we have the Python Django stack, the .NET stack. So this is generally what I call the Microsoft stack. So if you're going to be building within the Microsoft world, so you care about things like Active Directory and shudder the thought, SharePoint, and that type of stuff, basically you'd want to be building within the Microsoft tech stack. And everything that you're going to develop is going to have to be able to work well with all of the other products there. There's Maven stack. So this is a new one. It uses Vue.js. Think of that as a front-end framework. That's one of the new ones that the cool kids are using. As you'll see, there are a lot of different tech stacks out there. Again, what you're going to have to be thinking is when you're going to be developing your particular projects, what you're going to have to ask yourself is, what problems are you trying to solve for? Which individual technologies will help you solve those problems? And then you can go and figure out what stack to use. But you don't have to use the stacks that everybody else is using. Just like we do here at Silicon Dojo, you can kind of invent your own stack. So there you go. That's the idea of what a tech stack is and why it's going to be important to you as a programmer. Now, it is important to understand, especially as a new person, don't stress about this. Please do not stress that much, especially when you go to meetups and events to meet other coders and they start talking about their amazing stack. Right? Don't start sweating, don't freeze up, don't feel like you're stupid. All you do is pull out your little iPhone and go, what stack is that again? Click, 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 click. Okay, there you go. You know what that stack is now. Because again, like I say, in this modern world, there's just a tremendous number of stacks out there. As I talk about, 20 some odd years ago when I started in IT, again, it was basically the LAMP and the WAMP stack, and that's all there was. What's curious now is that there are so many products out there for you to use. Again, if you go back 20 years ago when I was thinking about using a database, right, I would use MySQL if I needed an open source, essentially a free database, MS SQL. So if I was in the enterprise environment and my company was paying the licensing, I'd buy MS SQL. And if my company had a lot of money, we would be using Oracle. Really, again, if you go back about 20 years ago, I'm not saying there weren't other databases out there, but in general, for most people, it came down to like 3 or 4 databases. That's about it, right? It was interesting though. I was watching a video. There's a YouTube channel called Fireship, and about a year ago, they put out a video on the 30 most popular databases in like 2024. Not even the 30 databases, the 30 most popular databases. We are literally drowning in options at this point in time if you're in the IT or the technology world. And so the thing to realize is, again, you go into an environment and they might be using any one of those databases I have no idea about. One of the important things you need to be thinking about then is, as a technology professional, is understanding what these databases do so that you have an idea of what people are talking about when they're using something like a database, right? So if you hear somebody say they use MySQL or MariaDB or Postgres or SQLite, that is going to be a relational database that uses a language called SQL, structured query language, in order to interact with it, right? So MariaDB and MySQL, those are actually just simply a fork. So a long time ago, MySQL was its own company. It got bought by Sun Microsystems. Sun Microsystems then got bought by Oracle. A lot of people got scared over that, and so since MySQL is an open source project, they forked MySQL from, they forked it, and so in that they created a new database called MariaDB. The interesting thing with MariaDB is I've been talking with people, and apparently the clustering is actually better than MySQL, at least for the open source edition. But the important thing to understand there is you don't need to go really in depth to understand how somebody is using a particular product. So if somebody says, oh, we're using MariaDB, you can say, oh, why are you using MariaDB over MySQL? And they can say, oh, because we found the clustering to be better. That's nothing to get that stressed over. Again, there's a database system now that's very popular called Postgres, and Postgres, I think, is faster for, it's either inserts or selects. So MariaDB and MySQL, more or less the same database. They're faster for inserts, I believe, and Postgres is faster for selects. We'll talk about that in a different class, but basically the same thing. All you really need to know is that it's a relational database, right? So if you go in and you start talking with people and they start saying things, basically the idea here is you go, oh, that's a front-end framework. So if somebody's talking about React or one of the other JavaScript, what are called front-end frameworks, we'll talk about that later, you just say, oh, that's a framework. Python, PHP, Ruby on Rails, whatever. Oh, that's the backend language. Again, database type. Oh, that's the database, right? And so that's how you can get a better idea of the environment people are working in. But again, don't get overly stressed about it. If you're sitting down and you're writing Python code, if you're not directly responsible for the database itself, again, for something like SQL that you're going to be sending to the database, it's all going to look the same. Whether you send it for Postgres, or whether you send it for SQLite, or whether you send it for MySQL or MariaDB, the SQL statement itself is more or less going to look the same. So it's not as big a deal as you might think it is. So anyways, that's all we're talking about when we're talking about tech stacks, is all the products that come together in order to make your product a deliverable solution.